Hello, punks. This morning, a box arrived for me from Nottingham. It contained this: a single red rose. Was it a declaration of love, of friendship, or a peace offering from one who was under siege? Let us place it here, in a cup of water, and see how long it lasts, before its leaves drop off. I venture to suggest it may be significantly longer than the lifespan of he who sent it. This video is about control and power in Warhammer Fantasy and who should wield it. Whether it's Games Workshop from their citadel in Nottingham because they own the IP, because they make the models, and because they write the official game, ruling like a benevolent dictator, or whether instead it's the mass of proletarian gamers out there on the streets who include you and me. I'm going to argue why it should be us who are in control, and why rebelling against Games Workshop is part of the very DNA of fantasy players. It's one of the things that makes us unique, that we're punks and we don't do what we're told. If the great dictator doesn't deliver a game that's fit for purpose, or indeed, witness the last decade, a supported game at all, we, the men of now, will take control of it ourselves, whether they like it or not. Let me start with the article that has inspired me on the Bell of Lost Souls. This bemoans Games Workshop losing control over Old World due to the Great Comp Rebellion, preached here on the Dr. Blaxill channel, if not first, but surely most loudly, and now presently in progress, as players apply sorely needed rebalancing and erratas to this dog's breakfast of a rule set throughout the world and support the 7 legacy factions that Games Workshop abandoned on the inspiring pretext of product differentiation from Age of Sigmar. Oh dear me. Pity the dictator, losing control of the game that he cared so much about that he murdered it and left it for dead for a decade. You see, punks, when the cause is just, and when the proletariat unite, in but the blink of an eye, even great leviathans begin to implode. Expect to see plenty more denouncements of the rebels in the weeks and months to come from the dictator or his mouthpieces and the non-clementura or his shadow apparatchiks. I wonder why they scream. Perhaps, punks, it might be because we're right. So, the article attacks the deleterious effects on comp, players changing the game for themselves by agreed changes and limitations. Limits on characters, nerfs to the good, buffs to the bad, and rules rewrites like comping Linehammer or playing without those daft things in the core rules. While the author makes it clear that the target for his ire is principally Games Workshop not fixing the game, his argument is of course implicitly that the punk rebel comping is actively harming Warhammer Fantasy because of the collapse of central authority. Without a hegemon at his centre, it means that Warhammer is, and I quote, not being played in a controlled or regulated way. Oh dear. Thus, the article says that it creates lots of different games, leading to a fragmentation of the player base, often those with grudges against Games Workshop and petty vendettas to fight, descending the gaming community into a mass of anarcho-syndicalism as the central authority collapses and nobody knows who to obey. Particularly, he identifies the relegation of those 7 beloved factions to unsupported and competitively illegal trash legacy status as a key fault line between the community who loves them and the great dictator who wishes to abolish them. The article concludes that the punks, well-intentioned or otherwise, are harming the game and calls for Games Workshop to stop us, to run our rebellion movement off the road with patches and rules fixes, and by either supporting the legacy factions or redoubling their efforts to pull them completely. Good luck with that, punk. Now, let me be clear. The target of this dispatch is not an attack on the article or its author, Abe Apfel. It's a good piece of journalism, worthy of the Daily Worker. Concise, factually correct, and provocative. But to me, it draws fundamentally the wrong conclusion. I'm going to tell you why the rebels and the punk compers are the good guys here, and why you should stand with the people against the corporation rather than the other way round. So, punks, I told you the revolution had started, and so it had proved, and more quickly than anybody expected. Let the great dictators scream as the people seize control, and their wailing dirges, a feeble protestation, be the melody of our validation. And when they come, with tanks rolling into the protest picket line to take on the rebels, at that point, of course, when they do that, they've lost. Just like all the other tyrants throughout history who did the same. My message to you, great dictator, is simple. Fix the game, or the proletariat will fix you. If you want me, you know where to find me. Send your cease and desist letters to Dr. Blaxill, Number 1, Committee for Public Safety, Nottingham. Your move, dictator. What's it going to be?
So in my last video about Rebellion, I explored the challenges and controversy around comp in Warhammer Fantasy past and present. I touched only briefly on the moral, political and historical arguments as to why comp is baked into the very DNA of Warhammer Fantasy players, and it's something that makes us unique. I've noticed quite a lot of commentary on this in the last few days, often from blogs and journal posts authored by younger people in the 40k or Age of Sigmar crowd who have observed that those Warhammer Fantasy players seem rather rebellious. They don't just wait for patches and updates from Games Workshop, they actually go in there and fix it themselves. How peculiar! Yes, punks, that's the kind of crowd we are. We do things ourselves, and there are very good reasons for that. We're not just consumer units, like those playing 4th ed Age of Sigmar, or 10th ed 40k, or at least some of them. No, we take matters into our own hands, because we're rebels. I'm going to tell you why that's the case, for 2 very good historical reasons. Now, first of all, a background detail before I delve into this history of rebellion in Warhammer Fantasy. The first one is that you watching this video, or the vast majority of you, are old men. Well, by old men, I mean that you've played Warhammer Fantasy before. Bearing in mind, of course, that it's 10 years ago since this game was shelved, and so that's rather remarkable. I have statistics on that point, in fact. The Square-based survey, with over 4,000 respondents, shows that 70% of players currently playing Warhammer the Old World have played a previous edition of Warhammer Fantasy. Over 3/4 of the people playing a modern game played one 10 years ago. That's remarkable. It also shows that 58% of us are at least in the 35 to 44 age bracket or older. So, when I talk about the past here, punks, I don't talk to just a small minority of grumpy old men. I speak instead to the mainstream. You old man greying around the temples aren't just men of yesterday. In this scene, you're also the modal men of now. Now, the length of this shadow of the past, I think, explains why we are rebels, and there are 2 reasons for this. Now, the first of these reasons really applies more to the older section. Those of you who have played early 7th edition and before, who respect Stillman, Priestley, Jervis Johnson, Thornton, Halliwell, Thorpe, Cavatori, etc. The second reason is for those of you who remember what happened at the age of 8th edition, and you had to rebel because Games Workshop blew up your world. Let's take both of those major genesis points of rebellion in turn. Let's start with the first one. And it's quite hard here to avoid pulling out a bunch of idealistic quotations from the grand old men of the past. I never tire of reading them, punks, and you, I hope, never tire of listening to them, for they are so wise. Let us begin once again with Rick Priestley, who I quoted on the last video, who signed off the 5th edition rulebook with a plea about questions, queries, and officialdom in the Warhammer hobby. Priestley argued that Warhammer is inherently adaptable, that rules and ideas in the game are merely a springboard to better and greater things, and wrote, "I would openly encourage players to invent and change the rules to their own taste." What more of a validation could that be? We're doing exactly what one of our founding fathers literally told us to do. Then you could look at Stillman, with his ultimate injunctions about the spirit of the game and his Stillmania column. Stillmania, of course, as a philosophy, as a group of holy chivalrous vows and injunctions, were all about being, that most nebulous of persons, a gentleman. Does a gentleman simply play the rules as written? Does a gentleman wait to be told what to do by a central authority before he makes the game better for himself and, more importantly, his opponents? No. A gentleman plays by his own rules, the rules that he senses are the best and most appropriate for those who he is in the company of, to make matters more enjoyable and more congenial for everyone, regardless of what an external authority says. We then got Pyranon, who wrote in a White Dwarf article, which I've struggled to find, but I think is somewhere in the 220s and the 230s, about what various key luminaries of that era thought about the spirit of the game, wrote that he wasn't disappointed when people make up the rules as a games designer. On the contrary, he was disappointed when people didn't make them up. Dave Kane, in the Spirit of the Game article in White Dwarf 221, also from the late 1990s, described a beardy player, in other words, the target of his ire, as someone who was more interested in playing the rules rather than the game. And of course, one might think from a modern perspective, what is the game if not the rules? It's that strange idea of gentlemanly conduct all over again. I once, as but a young whippersnapper, wrote a letter to what used to be called the Rules Boys, asking various queries about Warhammer Fantasy from the past. Because I was reared in the age of 4th edition and 5th edition, I was naturally very curious about things like the Palanquin of Nurgle and the beach-loading Bombard, and various things which didn't have rules in that edition. And I asked them about the Bretonnian war machines. And rather than saying they don't exist, they said there are no supported rules for them, but please make them up yourself and then send them to the Citadel Journal so that other players can use them. Wow. Now, when recalling this great age of anti-officialdom that was preached from Games Workshop in the 1990s, I am of course not even mentioning the real age of transgression that preceded that in the 1980s. The real era of punk and creativity, where following any kind of officialdom in a game where there was, after all, a games master who made things up would be an absolute anathema. It's like asking those inspirational men of them to cut their hair, wear a tie, trade their bike for a family car with a valid MOT, and listen to Blondie rather than Bolt Thrower. Now, all that was then, and it was long ago. But remember, kids, that when you talk to fantasy players who remember that time in the past, which many of us do, you talk to the disciples of Games Workshop when they were punks too. Insofar as they preached, it was a message that we should all be free men, and that we should not wait for or expect officialdom. Whether we were literally those countercultural punks in that great new age of fantasy and sci-fi in the 80s, or were simply hobbyists who loved the game and were trying to be stillmanic gentlemen in the 90s, we were all free. There was no pretense from Games Workshop that they had control, and no concern that they were losing it. They gave it up to us, with a wink and a smile and a fist bump of solidarity. We were all rebels, together. So I described to you the first generation of rebels. You might well say, Dr. Blaxill, hold your horses, things have changed. It's a different world now. We've got the internet, we've got meta. Yeah, you're right. So let me tell you about the second generation of rebels. Now, these were men who cut their teeth playing 8th edition in the early 2010s, before the Great Collapse, and of course those who continued to play Warhammer after, either its patched versions or its legacy fan project successors, the Ninth Age and the Warhammer Armies project. Now, Games Workshop, of course, had changed by then. It had long since ceased preaching rebellion as it did in the late 1990s. It had become much more official, much less likely to encourage players to make up rules themselves, and was of course thoroughly in the grip of its major shareholders, whose spiritual decay had reached such epidemic proportions that they elected Kirby as CEO and all that he stood for. Now, men of this era were of course rebels not by ideology, but by necessity, because they had to be. That was, of course, because of the fateful decision to first cut the oxygen supply from Warhammer Fantasy in 2013, and then to destroy it altogether in 2015 as a sacrifice to herald the new stillbirth of the coming age of Sigmar. Now, those events of tragedy and farce are of course burned into the minds of those who witnessed them, and cannot and should not be forgotten. First, let me talk to you about the oxygen. After 2013, Games Workshop went silent, and left the fantasy community to fend for itself. Glaring questions that needed to be answered were not, FAQs were never published, and support, to all extents and purposes, ceased. The community had then to regain control, because even those who wanted, bend the knee, found the throne empty. The king had gone, and we had to govern ourselves. Witness then the birth of Comp, Swedish Comp, Tally Comp, the ETC Comp, all of which helped to rebalance a magnificent but flawed game, because its own master would not do so himself. And then the calamity, of course, at the end. In a sea of comedic iconoclasm, the great edifice of 8th edition, flawed though it may have been, was cast into the void to be replaced by round bases, 4 pages of rules, no points values, etc. So then, these self-governing rebels, witnessing the mushroom cloud of nuclear Armageddon descending, had to choose. Either assimilate into the age of Sigmar collective, with its end-of-history postmodern multiverse of indistinct lore, undefined rules, and proto-space marines, or take the rebellion home into the next level. Play 8th, now unsupported and banned, or perhaps travel further back in time to play an older edition of fantasy, more to your taste. Alternatively, create your own game, a la the 9th Age, or WAP, or of course leave the Warhammer Fantasy Square-based realm completely and go to another one, perhaps Kings of War. Now, all of you who were there then, and who are watching this now, became rebels then whether you liked it or not. So you see, the men of that post-Armageddonic world had no choice but to organise ourselves into self-governing anarchist republics. Questions needed to be answered, rules needed to be clarified, and we needed to create a game that was worth us playing it. We looked to Games Workshop for leadership, but instead all they did was blow up our world. Across the pond in Warhammer 40,000, a debate about officialdom occurred in the years that followed, as 7th edition gave way to 8th edition, and the independent tournament circuit and others challenged Games Workshop's authority from below. But in the years that followed that, the last 8 years, the company is transformed into a corporate behemoth of unprecedented proportions, which has totalitarian control over its supported games. Its player base look to it for formal patches, for leadership, and indeed the answer for more or less any question. There is no rebellion in Warhammer 40,000. There is no rebellion in Age of Sigmar. Perhaps they don't know how to rebel. But in this land, we haven't seen that corporate expansion. We haven't learned what it is to be a consumer base of a modern wargame. And quite frankly, I'm quite happy that we haven't learned. So, there you have it. Games Workshop have resurrected the old world, not because they're nice, not because they love Warhammer Fantasy, and certainly not because they love you, but because they think it will make their shareholders money. But they shouldn't expect to wield any control over a community of old and not-so-old punks. We're rebels to the core, the first generation of us, because we were taught to rebel by Games Workshop, and the second generation because we had no choice after our formal inspirational leader turned his guns on us and blew up our world. So, Dictator, we're pleased you've come back with your new, albeit fundamentally flawed, iteration of the game. But don't expect control, don't expect sycophancy, don't expect compliance, and don't expect surrender. The crowd you address remember the past very well, and we see the king who now fled this land and discarded his crown but wants to rule it again for the hypocrite he is. And despite all that, I still sense goodwill, a desire to trust you, your design team, and the game you created. But that's conditional. If you want our loyalty, If you want to head off the punk rebellion, fix the game, fix the core rules, address the balance problems, and support the legacy factions. If you do, you won't so much win, but you just won't be thrown from your horse. And you may reflect that this is what happens when you deal with men who have learned to be free. My final point is about fragmentation in the game. This is the principal spectre that is held before us by the Bell of Lost Souls article. It is also one of the popular arguments against comp, that if everyone plays their own versions of Warhammer the Old World, that the community will become fractured and that this is bad. I disagree with this point. Not because I disagree that the community will become fractured, because I think it will. I think there will be a period of anarchy. I think various localized versions of the game will emerge, and competitive players won't be able to take the same lists to different events. But I also don't think that this is a problem, because I don't see what's wrong with fragmentation. Why do we require centralization? Why do we require direction? Why do we need to be playing in a controlled and regulated way? What is wrong with anarcho-syndicalism, where self-governing gamer republics all play their own versions of the rules? Some might play with that praiseworthy square-based legacy patch, some might play with missions, others might limit heroes, others might boost infantry, and some of us, oh the heretics, might change the core rules, like limiting Linehammer, getting rid of that ridiculous paying for your wheeling out of charge rather than having closest to closest and rolling the dice like we did in 8th edition, getting rid of those mandatory overrun straightforwards, or those pursuits on flat roll, or the stupid impetuous rule, the list goes on. What's wrong with any of that? Why the control and standardization fetish? Why not simply let everyone do what they want? To me, the spectre of fragmentation's deleterious effects really need to be explained, because I don't think it's obvious. Without such an explanation, one concludes that advocates of control and uniformity are probably that from first principles, either because they are the dictator himself or his henchmen and his favoured vassal lords who get free stuff in the post, who are preaching on his behalf. We do have some implied problems with fragmentation, however, which are alluded to in this article, albeit obliquely, and I have seen made elsewhere. Perhaps the principal one is that such a fragmented game will be off-putting to new players, who naturally prefer to play out of the box. Now, I agree with this in theory. Obviously, it would be better if there was one agreed way of playing, and it would certainly be easiest if that was the official way that one found in the Warhammer the Old World rulebook and out of the box. But what if that official way of playing is suboptimal? What if it's deficient? What if it's even boring? What if a new player doesn't appreciate having his list smashed off the board by Double Dragon, that finds that the magnum opus of his infantry regiment is reduced to redundant spectators, that is appalled by the spectre of Linehammer or those ridiculous vomit-like blobs of 40k style models with no one having arcs of sight? If I had to choose, I'd rather have a better fractured game than a poorer centralized one. And that's the argument why comp is useful and why actually a comped game, while unofficial, while fragmented, might actually be better for new players simply because it might be a better game. A second point on fragmentation that I wish to attack is the folly of the notion that a fragmented community will necessarily stay fragmented. I find this highly unlikely to be the case. In the marketplace of ideas, one version of comp, or at least a small number of them, are likely to rise to the top, mainly because they carry the blessing of competitive players. Thus, new consensuses can and will form. Witness the chat, for example, concerning the square-based legacy comp pack. That's not because this pack is radical, but because it's emerged from vigorous discussion between competitive players on the largest Old World fan channel. Another example of this potentially good comp can be seen in missions. I just went to an excellent Old World tournament last weekend called the Black Country Brawl in Walsall. There, they used missions lifted from the Knife Age, which had real and meaningful impacts on the results of games. Because these missions were so well received by the players there, who are a competitive crowd who are more likely to organise their own events, I fully expect them to be influential moving forwards. That's what I mean. Democratic discourse doesn't need to be a confused babble. Good ideas that are well supported can rise to the top, and bad ones fall away. Thus, expect to see widely supported comps and patches emerge that are so widely supported that they become quasi-official. This is just what happened in 8th edition with Swedish comp, Tally comp, and ETC comp, so it will apply here in the old world too. As in real history, true anarchy is only a temporary state. Power inevitably forms around certain structures as synthesis emerges after thesis and antithesis collide. Thus, powerful consensuses can and will form in Warhammer the Old World. The difference is that such consensuses will emerge from below rather than being installed arbitrarily from above. It's not milk and honey, of course. As Marx warns us, the emergent worker state can be mired in bureaucracy and party factionalism as the pigs argue with each other on who should replace Farmer Jones. But the argument that we might not use freedom wisely is never a good reason for staying enslaved. A third point, if I may, and I'll keep my sunglasses on for this one. That's that competitive players shouldn't care if they can't take the same army to each and every event because comp forces them to do things differently. Do you really want to keep taking 3 dragons, 6 screams, or Pegageddon 360 Bretonians to play the same games again and again? Wouldn't you rather play without those crutches? What about with missions that make you do things differently? Maybe then the game won't just be about building the invincible army and meta-chasing, but instead about playing the game skillfully and in varied contexts. Then, he who wins events and rises to the top of the rankings might be best at Warhammer. Now, I know that for many of you, this channel is of course a slice of Old England. So let me use an analogy from that most English of games, the gentlemanly game of cricket. The player wanting to take advantage of his broken army ad nauseum in a world of stasis is much like a batsman who insists that each and every cricket pitch is made exactly the same so he can bully the bowling in his comfort zone. But of course, to be regarded as a true champion, that isn't enough. He has to be able to master playing the moving ball under leaden skies in England, riding the hard fast bounce in Australia and South Africa, and surviving ordeal by spin in the subcontinent. So is true of competitive Warhammer. The true champion can win under multiple comps precisely because he is not a robot jerkily moving in the same way each and every time. He dances his own steps, and when the music changes, so does he. So, in my first video about the Great Rebellion, I told you what the rebellion should be. Now, in this sequel, I remind you why we are of immutable rebel lineage. As to the question of how, well, that's up to you to decide, isn't it? But that question is being answered, slowly and inevitably, from below, even as we speak. My message is this. Games Workshop are indeed losing control of Warhammer the Old World, and that's a thoroughly good thing. When they lose control, we gain it, and it's liberation, powered by the battering ram of comp which breaches the Sheriff of Nottingham's castle. Comrades, don't listen to the spineless sycophants or the dictator's marketing meat grinder. You've always been punks, and I know you're with me. Don't let them silence you. Don't let them scare you with their truncheons. We can fight, we can resist, and we can win!